Okay, so as we were discussing, three important aspects of earthquake resistant design is first is the configuration, the structural configuration, so that we minimize those additional torsional and effects due to eccentricity that arise because of the structural configuration. So if we can eliminate, we can minimize that, that will be uh, reducing the demand on the structure, and structure is going to be more economical to design. Second one, when we realize that we are not really going to design, or we do not need to design our buildings, most of the buildings, to withstand uh, earthquakes, which are very random phenomena, to resist them within elastic limit, then we look for building in additional margin of factor of safety by adding redundancies into the system, so that even if capacity is exceeded at some point, there is alternate load path available to continue to carry on the load, continue to carry on supporting the load imposed on the structure. And then thirdly, we also try to enhance our seismic performance capabilities by adding this energy dissipation. I mean, this is strain energy is like arm twisting, arm wrestling. Uh, if I need to design for larger earthquakes, more demands need to be accommodated, and I can actually, it is possible for me to design a structure to withstand it elastically by increasing the strain energy capacity, strain energy storage capacity. But that is going to be very uneconomical system. I can possibly think of ways of dissipating energy which comes once in a while. It is not that this kind of energy bin would be required, would be called into use on day-to-day basis. So I don't really need that excess energy capacity on day-to-day basis. So if it is to be called into use only once in a while or very sporadically, then I can afford to rely on or make good of the non-linear behavior or inelastic behavior, inelastic deformation, which will dissipate energy by virtue of hysteresis like this. So now more hysteresis, larger amount of energy can be dissipated if this yield plateau is larger. So that brings us to another criteria for earthquake resistant design is how do I ensure that this I can get this I can stretch this yield plateau to the maximum extent possible. And it so happens that it is very easy to do, to extend it reasonably large strain levels, to reasonably accommodate large strain levels. All that is required to do is very special reinforcement detailing, or the for reinforced concrete structures, and connection detailing for steel structures, right? So it's only a matter of detailing which can accommodate this, and we can take care of this. Now, as I said in the beginning, in the earlier discussion, we try to avoid this kind of portal mechanism which will lead to global collapse, structure turning into a sway mechanism, and we prefer to have this local kind of damage. I mean, so damage is inevitable, but we would design such our structure such a way that this kind of damage is facilitated and this kind of damage is avoided. Now, how do I facilitate that? Right. So, as I said, this kind of column sway mechanism so These are the hinges, plastic hinges form here in columns. So this has to be avoided, and we may actually encourage system to behave such that we may get hinges in the beam, and there may be some hinges at the base of the column. That is something that cannot be avoided, right? Because the overturning moments would all eventually come back to the foundation. So at these points we cannot really avoid formation of hinges. So this kind of mechanism is encouraged. So how do we achieve this? Any ideas? Can you think of something? How do I avoid this kind of failure by, let's say, under the influence of combined horizontal and vertical load?
We can provide strong column and weak beam.
Yes, Hardik, louder please.
Sir, we can provide strong columns and weak beams.
Yes, that is what this strong column weak beam concept actually refers to. This can be very easily avoided if you recall the bending moment diagram. How does the bending moment diagram look like? The bending moment is going to be same at this point, at the junction. Value is going to be same here and as well as at the beam, right? So bending moment value is going to be same because of the basic compatibility issues. So if I make these columns, the capacity of columns, the elastic capacity of these columns a little higher than what is the capacity of the beams, then immediately as soon as I reach this elastic limit, then the damages will begin to accumulate at this beam level and the column will still remain elastic. So this is what we call as strong column and weak beam system. By this we do not mean that beam is in any way inferior. All that we mean is capacity of the beam is kept lower than the capacity or the moment capacity, ultimate moment capacity of the columns that meet at a joint, at a beam column junction, so that columns are not really loaded beyond their elastic limit capacity, elastic behavior, and the beams would incur these plastic deformations whenever the capacities exceed, whenever the earthquake of intensity greater than what has been designed for elastic behavior strikes the area, occurs in the area. So that when this happens, the building will of course sustain damage, there will be excessive deformation, there will be damage in the beam, but most of the time these damages will be repairable and the building can be salvaged. So we do not quite often need to demolish the building or as an extreme measure, and of course definitely the inhabitants of the building would not be harmed in any way. Their health and their well-being is ensured, and also the property or whatever the contents of the building, they are not really damaged. For normal earthquakes, usually they will probably undergo sustained damages or extensive losses, in the event of very rare and very extreme earthquakes. But even in those cases, we do not allow the structure to collapse, right? So then we have different kinds of, you understand the limit states, but seismic limit states have, now that we have different definitions under these definition criteria. Seismic one is of course the serviceability. And second one is what we call as damage control. There are different ways, these are defined in different codes. Third one is what we call as life safety, or even sometimes there is a different category, or it is clubbed into same, collapse prevention. Right, so these all, I mean, this is something what is now clubbed under what is the current buzzword in the earthquake engineering profession. Performance based seismic design or seismic engineering, PBSE or PBSD, whatever is your preferred buzzword. Right, so what this means is essentially we realize that we cannot, I mean, earthquakes are random and we cannot really predict which size of earthquake is going to occur, which kind of earthquake will choose to visit the facility after it is constructed. So we take into cognizance that I mean, we may have to deal with different earthquakes of different sizes, and we cannot really have one rigid design criteria to withstand performance criteria of the structure. That is what you design for normally when you deal with static loads, gravity loads, and even wind loads. You usually have a specific performance criteria that structure has to perform within these limits. Stresses should not exceed beyond this, and the deformation should not exceed beyond this limit, right? So it is the same thing, similar thing, except that these limits would keep on changing with the level of earthquake that we deal with. So serviceability limit state is a it is applicable for small earthquakes. Damage control, this is what we call as design basis earthquake, where the building will sustain damage, and most of the time it will still be repairable, and we can put the building to use again after some small disruption in service or something like that. right? But building most probably will not be required to be demolished. So that is damage control limit state. And then life safety is for very rare extreme event. A case in point is like March 2011 Japan earthquake. Do you recall Fukushima disaster?
Yes, sir. You heard about it.
So Fukushima nuclear power plant, it led to a series of faults, one fault leading to another fault, and it was a massive disaster. Nuclear radiation leakage, and all sorts of things happening. And that kind of earthquake, you don't see that. Magnitude 9.5 magnitude earthquake, very rare and extreme event. Nobody designs for those kind of earthquakes, right? So if that happens, but we don't design for those kind of earthquakes, but then that doesn't really mean that those earthquakes cannot occur just because we do not consider them in our design calculation. That is not a guarantee that very rare and extreme earthquakes will not occur during the lifetime of a structure. So if they happen, then what we try to ensure that structure should not collapse on anybody's head. So the inhabitant's life should be protected. The investment will not be protected, need not be protected, and the structure may be inhabitable after the earthquake, may be beyond repair, and entire thing will have to be demolished, and we need to build something afresh, right? So these are the different kinds of performance levels. So this is very different from what you expect in a normal conventional design, that you have one set of performance levels and you need to design to provide for those performance levels. In case of earthquake resistant design, we need to be aware of requirement of different kinds of performances. The structure needs to perform in a different manner to earthquakes of different types, of earthquakes of different intensities. So for small earthquakes, serviceability limit states means the structure remains completely operational, no damage whatsoever, right? Not even non-structural damage, or maybe very minor non-structural cracks, or here and there plaster cracks or something like that, right? But otherwise the functionality of the building is not at all affected. Design basis earthquake, so this earthquake is maybe return period is once in 50 years roughly. So that's the kind of earthquake that we are looking for. Design basis earthquake, that's 475 years. Now again, this is one number that has come up. Somebody thought of worked out these numbers based on the Poisson rate of occurrence, and the numbers, design numbers were reasonable, and that number has stuck. It has, ideally this has to be calibrated with respect to the socio-economical conditions of every country. You cannot have a uniform criteria for design basis earthquake for all over the world, right? What is acceptable risk maybe for us may be different from what is the acceptable level of risk for other countries. Realizing that we are a resource scarce nation. We are accommodating almost 1/4 of the whole world's population, 25% of the world population approximately, and we hold only about how much? 3% of the land mass, right? So that's a very unfair or very steep, very critical condition, that I cannot choose to build. I do not have the luxury not to build in areas which are earthquake prone, because I do not have a choice. We do not have land mass to carry out all sorts of activities. I need to provide for industrial activity, I need to provide for agricultural activities, I need to provide for residential accommodation, I need to provide for warehouses and storage, etc. So how do you manage that? In 3% of the world land mass, you need to accommodate almost 20-25% of the world population. So I do not have the luxury to avoid areas which are known to be earthquake prone. So in that case, if I have to do that, then I have to live with some more element of risk, and probably I need to look at also the economic condition. What is the economic strength of the or payment capacity? How much is the client willing to pay for what is the safety that is guaranteed, and so on. So all those decisions are based on that, and unless a very sound socio-economic framework is established, there is not really any reason for adoption of any such return period number. And that goes for this 50 years also, but this 50 years is inconsequential because nothing really happens in 50 years. Earthquakes are very small, so it really doesn't matter whether I write 50 years here or 60 years or for that matter 40 years. Nothing will really happen to the structure that I am dealing with, right? But this is very important, and similarly for rare and extreme, most of the time this is what we consider is the extreme event. So MCE, we call it as maximum credible earthquake, and or maximum considered earthquake. That's the now more politically correct term, because maximum credible earthquake is questionable in the context that we do not have complete information. We do not have the complete information, so we cannot really be so sure that no earthquake greater than this will ever occur in this region, because we have not mapped the entire earth, and there may be some hidden features lurking somewhere down, and that we may not be aware of. So a correct scientifically correct statement would be, this is the maximum that we are considering for this region at this point in time. We are open to revise our opinion if more evidence surfaces, right? So then we look at what is MCE, that is the maximum considered earthquake, right? So now, as we discussed, three basic characteristics. The structural configuration, we need to take care of three cornerstones of earthquake resistant design, or configuration, and then the strength, or I should say inelastic deformations. So when I say inelastic deformations, it accounts for both redundancies as well as the ductility. And third is this differential strengths. Right, this is also called more commonly referred to in design codes or design books as capacity based design. One example is what we refer to as strong column, weak beam system, right? So we provide more capacity in columns and relatively less capacity in beams, so that we encourage development of plastic hinges in beams rather than in columns. And when we do that, we avoid the formation of column sway mechanism, which is actually a global failure mechanism, and entire structure load carrying capacity is severely compromised in that particular mode of deformation. And on the other hand, if we include plastic deformations in weak in the beam, then it is a localized failure. And even in that, when I say a weak beam, even in beams, we do not allow beam to fail in shear. Shear capacities are provided much higher margin of safety as compared to the flexural capacities, right? Because the flexural deformations, flexural inelastic deformations are ductile in nature. Shear capacity, if it is exceeded, then it's a brittle failure, and entire structure will, it will lead to a cascading effect. So shear, even in when I say weak beam, even in weak beam, the shear capacities are given larger margin of safety as compared to the flexural capacities, so that the flexural deformations or inelastic deformations in flexural mode are encouraged. So it's not just the structural elements. Within a structural element, different deformation modes are also given differential treatment, preferential treatment, right? And that is what is the essence of this capacity based design. And we will be discussing about ways and means about this in the course of in this course this semester, right? So this is the basic introduction. Now I would like to rush through some examples of earthquake damage, why those damages happen, and what are the problems. And if you understand those damages, how earthquake affects the buildings or affects the structural system, then that gives you an idea of what you need to protect against, or what are the capacities, why this kind of damage has happened, and how do I take countermeasures such that this kind of damage or this kind of failure is avoided, or this kind of collapse can be prevented, right? So I will run through some of the slides. Are you able to see this?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Earthquake structural damage?
Yes, sir.
Okay, fine.
Yes, sir.
So the damage types, basically structural elements and non-structural elements. So I'm sure you all of you are aware of what is a structural element, what is non-structural element. So main causes of damage: one, due to ground movements and soil changes, then the building shapes, as I said, the configuration and the dimension, and then the capacity exceeding, when the structural capacities are exceeded, so that is due to inelastic deformation of the elements. So due to ground movements and soil changes, if the structure of course has to rest on ground, and that is the assurance that we take for granted, that the building will rest on terra firma. But what to do when terra is not so firma? Then you have the entire basis is under question. So you need to look for landslides, ground liquefaction, tsunamis and fault movements, very large displacements right under the foundation. So the foundation is torn apart. So these are essentially geotechnical problems, not much that a structural engineer can do anything about it. It's more of a geotechnical engineering concern, but it's good to be aware of what are the problems that you are looking at. So this is the most famous example of liquefaction that happened in Niigata earthquake in Japan, 1964. You see this building, entire building is perfectly fine, no damage. It's just that it just toppled over. All these buildings in the vicinity, they are in different angle of tilt, right? And this particular building actually almost tilted by 90 degree. All this happened because the soil underneath gave way. So there was no soil to support the structure, and the sand actually became like a liquid. So ground liquefaction essentially means that the soil loses its shear strength completely. It begins to flow like a liquid, and when that happens, obviously it will sink. Anything on top of it, heavier bodies, they will sink. So that's what happened during this 1964 earthquake. This is another example of liquefaction. Soil gave way, it just flowed out from the underneath the structure. Now these are the fault movements. You can't do anything if ground moves by this amount. Your foundation cannot really expand or contract according to ground movements. So if the foundation itself is torn apart, there is very little that you can do, and that's why the site prospecting and site survey or siting considerations are very, very important, that you do not construct a raft across a fault line, right? That's a recipe of for disaster. Now we come to the building shape, or what is the because of structural configuration. So soft story failure, that is, if I have, this is very common, and you would see most of the multi-storied buildings, you will see that ground floor is kept, there are no infill walls. That is because you need to provide for parking space. So you have this thing, ground floor, open ground floor, which is, because of the absence of these infills, these are very, very flexible. On top of it, you have structural system with infill panels, and these are very stiff. So when the earthquake happens, there is going to be a very large deformation in the open story, because it is a very flexible system and there is a very heavy mass sitting on top of it. So this brings to very high ductility demand, because it's going to be these are columns, flexible columns, and subjected to very large deformation, and that leads to, there is no way we can accommodate this kind of large deformations elastically, and most of the time this leads to the complete collapse, because it is a basis of the, entire structure is supported on those ground floor columns, and these things generally collapse, and it leads to what is classically referred to as the pancake kind of collapse. Right, so these are some of the structural configuration errors. This is the time of kind of deformation that I was referring to. It's a very heavy mass sitting on top of very flexible set of columns, and there is going to be very excessive deformation under the ground movement, lateral movement of the ground. So this is actual construction, and you see this column getting damaged here because of this is soft story. Although this is not a very tall structure, you can see that there are only 2 stories above this ground floor. Even then, it is a cause of concern. Now, this is another problem. I mean, soft story cannot really be only at the, not necessarily only at the ground floor. Sometimes because of functional reasons, you may choose to remove some columns. I mean, for example, in this case, 5th story restaurant, open structure. So they very coolly removed the partition and tried to use the entire area for their use. So nothing, no problem with it as long as it was, I mean, it is taken care of in the vertical load, and vertical load carrying capacity is accounted for. But it's a serious problem when you are looking at horizontal load resistance. Then there is suddenly lack of continuity here in the transfer of loads, and the structural elements, vertical structural elements in this particular floor are very heavily stressed, and they were not really accounted for in design, and that leads to what is you can see here as the pancake collapse. The entire floor just got crushed, right? It is as if this floor never existed. So obviously lives were lost, and property were also lost. Then short column failure. So some of the unintended structures, for example, I may modify it internally. Entire original structure was designed like this, but because of functional requirement, I may modify it like this, add some kind of appendage here. Now this adds restraint to the column here. So now the effective height, effective length of the column is not this. Effective length of the column is only this much. Now, if it is if all the columns have to move by the same amount, if this slab is cast monolithically, then all the under lateral deformation, all the columns will have to move by the same amount. Then for the same amount of deformation, how does the stiffness change? Stiffness changes by the reciprocal of cube of length, L cube, right? So in this case, length is reduced by half, so the shear force in this column is going to be 8 times more than the shear force that that is experienced by these full length columns, right? Now of course you don't design for this kind of amplification of column shears. So obviously this kind of thing, particularly when this is unintended and not really accounted for design, this kind of appendage, then this is going to fail drastically, and this is going to be a brittle failure, catastrophic failure. It will just give way suddenly. So this is how it works. So initial design did not anticipate this infill panel, and because of the deformation, you say that only this much of the column was brought into practice, brought into force, and this led to much higher shear force than what was anticipated, what was accounted for in design, and obviously it led to the failure. I mean, complete concrete core got crushed, and that's a complete shear failure. And as you can see, there is not enough stirrups to give the necessary shear strength, right? So this is typical example of short columns. So increasing stiffness brings out more shear force, and the entire column fails in shear. These are typical, very classical examples of diagonal shear cracks, which are caused by the exceeding shear capacities in columns. So these are torsional failure. Ignore this spelling error. So as I said, center of rigidity is not coincident with the center of mass, and that leads to the eccentricity and additional shear force, additional column shears, and that may lead to the failure of the corner columns, particularly where the effect of eccentricity is maximum. And then we have pounding, where different buildings very close by, and they deform, they may vibrate out of phase, and then they may actually come towards each other during vibration, and they may fail, right? So similarly, we have these column failures, again because of inadequate confinement, and then once the capacities exceed, then the columns will buckle, and entire thing leads to the other. So there are special recommendation. Spiral confinements are performed much better than separate stirrups, and particularly when the rectangular stirrups are provided at a very large spacing, then this kind of buckling of reinforcement cannot be avoided. So these are another example of column failure. And then this is the bond failure, not adequate development length and anchorage in the beam column for the column reinforcement. So it will just come out. So lap splices, again bond failure, not enough development length to develop the bond. Then the failure of stirrup hook, very typical cause of neglect at construction site, when we provide stirrups with 90-degree bend, and they would just open up during earthquakes. So these are the shear failures of columns. Then these are some of the buckling beam failure. Beams can also fail in shear if not adequate provision is made, and that's what I said. Even if the beam is designed to be weaker than columns, we do not make it weak in shear strength. We provide much higher margin of safety. So these are again development length and lack of bond. So I will stop here. You can have a look at these projects, case studies, and I will provide for